the roll call, Brian.
Sure, I'm gonna name the municipality. If the voting member present could please state their name. Ulster County,
Ed Pine.
City of Kingston,
John Schulteis.
Town of Saugerties,
Vernon Benjamin.
Town of Ulster, New York State Department of Transportation,
Amy McKenzie,
New York State Thruway Authority. Nancy Zhu, you already announced yourself. Thank you. Town of Hurley, Town of Esopus.
Danielle Freer.
Thank you, Danielle. Welcome. Town of
Hi.
Marlborough, Town of Shawangum, Village of New Paltz,
Tim Rogers.
Town of Wawarsing, Town of Kingston, Town of Rochester.
Mike Baden.
Great. We have 8 members present. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Do you want to run through other attendees, Dennis?
That's what I was going to do. Thank you. I
Sorry.
was going to ask anybody else on the line to identify themselves.
Do you want me to run down the list, Dennis?
Thank you, David. That'd be much more efficient, I think.
Okay. All right. And apologies if I call somebody that's already been on as part of the roll call. I'll do my best here. Let's see here. Stana Weisberg.
Donna Weisberg, Village of New Paltz.
Okay, I have Tom Baird, Chris Kate, Chris Hannett, Greg Krupp, Neil Batez, Peter Cristiano. Let's see here. Sorry, it's bouncing around here. And did I miss anyone? Oh, Herb Litz has joined as well. Did I miss anyone else?
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, Herb. How are you? Second item on the agenda is call for citizens' comments. Any citizens' comments? Any comments from any of our guests? Any comments from any board members? Okay. Approval of the policy committee meeting summary. The June 29th, 2021 policy committee meeting summary was previously tabled. I get a motion for discussion purposes for those minutes.
So move, Mike Baden.
Thank you, Mr. Baden. Do I have a second?
Vernon Benjamin.
Thank you, Mr. Benjamin. I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? To make this easier, any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, so carried. August 24th, 21 policy committee meeting summary. Do I have a motion for discussion purposes?
So move, Mike Baden.
Thank you, Mr. Baden. Do I have a second?
It's Vernon.
Thank you, Mr. Benjamin. I have a motion and second. Any discussion? Hearing none. Any opposed? Any abstentions? So carried. Number 4, communications and announcements. Brian?
I have no transportation specific communications or announcements at this time. We are awaiting a number of announcements that we would expect the New York State Department of Transportation to have, at least regarding Bridge New York. I'm hoping could come at any time this year. Amy, do you have any additional insight regarding Bridge New York?
we haven't heard anything yet either.
Okay, thank you. One other item that comes to mind actually is the tip update process. As we informed members during our last technical committee meeting, the UCTC, along with MPO statewide and the New York State Department of Transportation, will be updating the tip and the STIP throughout the first half of 2022. So we will be forming that TIP subcommittee. Technical committee members should anticipate receiving correspondence from me probably next week, maybe later this week, requesting volunteers to sit on the TIP subcommittee. If you are a municipality with a federal aid project on the TIP expected to go to construction within the next 2 to 3 years, within that time period, I strongly recommend that you volunteer to sit on the TIP subcommittee because you will have significant input regarding schedule adjustments and even the possibility of doing cost adjustments to your federal aid projects through that process. The best way to get input on the update of the TIP is just to sit on the subcommittee. And come next month, we'll walk you through that process. We'll walk everyone through what the TIP update looks like. But we're awaiting guidance on how the process will evolve, which includes fiscal targets that will be provided to the MPOs by the Department of Transportation. We're anticipating in February. That's all I have.
Thank you, Brian. Any comments or questions? Thank you. Hearing none. Number 5, new businesses. Resolution number 2021-11, UCTC Resolution 2021-11. It's an apportionment of Federal Transit Administration American Rescue Plan Act funds, Section 5307 and 5340, formula funds attributable to the Kingston urbanized area. I have a motion for discussion purposes.
Ed
John
Pine, I'll make
Schulteis.
the motion.
Mike Baden, I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Pine. Who is the second? I apologize.
Mike Baden.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Baden. I have a motion and a second. Brian, discussion?
Certainly, as the resolution and the agenda explains, these are Federal Transit Administration funds made available through the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. We already did an appropriation last year for CARES Act. This is funding specific to the Kingston urbanized area and funds generated through that urbanized area. If you look at attachment 1 on page 3 of the agenda, it explains the amount of funds available to the Kingston urbanized area. The funds can only be used by designated recipients within the urbanized area, and the only designated recipient is the County of Ulster through the operation of Ulster County Area Transit. So those funds will be made available. These are 5307 funds, so they can be used for capital or operation.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions? Any additional discussion from the council?
Hello, John Morrow here.
Welcome, John.
Thanks, John.
Vernon, is this a project, is this where we can look for our sidewalk project on 9W?
Yeah, hi, Vern. Yeah, you submitted that inquiry to me last week, and I did provide a detailed response. Were you able to review that
Oh.
email?
Maybe not, but I'll go back and look.
Okay, so regarding your inquiry, no, these are Federal Transit Administration funds. And as I explained, they can only be used by Ulster County Area Transit generally for transit purposes. I mean, in some instances, you can use these 5307 funds for a sidewalk to connect to a transit facility, but I don't believe that's necessarily what you're proposing here. Other types of funding sources are available for pedestrian projects like sidewalks, the TAP funds, for example, but that call for projects was this past summer and is now closed. If you have additional questions, I know we've been playing phone tag a little bit, please, by all means, reach out to me after you've reviewed that email. I'm happy to talk more about your sidewalks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vernon. Any other questions or comments? Hearing none on the motion. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Item A is so carried. Thank you. Item B, Resolution 2021-12. It's an amendment to the UCTC fiscal year 2024 Transportation Improvement Program TIP to add a new UCAT project PIN number 8TU009 and a new project 8TU010 as shown in attachment 1. I have a motion for discussion purposes.
So move, Mike Baden.
Thank you. I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Ed Pine.
I have a motion and discussion and a second. Brian, discussion?
Sure. If you draw your attention to attachment 1 on page 2 of the resolution, this amendment to the TIP is to add 2 new projects to the listing. I think as we're all familiar by now, any addition or deletion to the TIP requires a full amendment and 15-day public comment period. During that comment period, we received no comments on this action. The 2 projects to be added to the TIP utilize 5307 funds made available through the Mid-Hudson Valley Transportation Management Area. Those funds are from our unallocated savings that the TMA keeps record of over the course of a 5-year period. And we did a solicitation, a call for projects to utilize the funds. And UCAT did submit an application and those funds were awarded. It took us some time to iron out some of the details on how they would be listed on the TIP, which is why resolution 2021-6 was actually passed, which approved use of the funds, and that was passed back in the spring. So based on resolution 2021-6, we are now programming these projects on the TIP as described here. Briefly, there are 2 specific projects. One is for architectural and engineering design services for a new UCAT bus storage facility. We did do a site selection planning process to identify suitable locations in Ulster County for that facility. The next step will be to actually design for the construction of that facility. So that's $1.25 million to do that project. The second project is for the purchase of battery electric buses and associated charging equipment for the UCAT fleet, and $3.750 million is made available for that project. Both these projects require 20% local match and state match.
Thank you, Brian. Anyone from UCAT on the call?
I don't believe so.
Any discussion from the council members?
Yeah, Ed Pine,
Comments, questions?
has the site been selected yet for the facility or not yet?
We did a site selection feasibility analysis. We did in 2 years, we started a project about 1.5 years ago. There is a site on Golden Hill that we looked at. There is also a site at Tech City that we've looked at. That said, when you program these in with federal dollars, we'll have to go through that process again, but there is a site selection matrix. But the preferred site is on Golden Hill. It's adjacent to the existing building, actually across the street from the existing building. Any additional comments from the council? Questions? Hearing none. Any opposed? Any abstentions? So carried.
Thank you.
Thank you. Item 6, other old business. Brian, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Yeah, I have no new information to offer here. During the last technical committee, we provided an overview of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was recently passed into law. There have been a variety of PowerPoint presentations and discussions regarding what is in the bill. 50% of that bill is for transportation projects, of that 50% of the infrastructure bill. So it's a pretty big investment, and obviously we're wondering how this is going to affect the TIP update process. I think we'll be learning more about that in the weeks ahead.
Any questions? Brian, UCCT tip update. We touched on that. Do you have anything more to say about it?
No, not at this point in time, but again, I'll send just a reminder to get a list of volunteers. And when we do have those meetings, they will very likely be virtual, and we'll set an agenda and we'll lay out the process at that time.
Okay, thank you. And Amy, just from the Transportation Council staff, we would hope that NISDOT will share its TIP update allocation formulas as soon as possible, so we understand what we're able to program. In addition, we would hope that NISDOT would share its proposed projects for the region as soon as possible as well, so that we're not in the middle of a TIP update project and moving towards a deadline, and then we're handed a sort of the projects that NISDOT wants funded. We believe we deserve some notice in terms of what projects NISDOT wants to fund, and in particular within Ulster County and elsewhere, and in particular with respect to the Infrastructure and Jobs Investment Act. So if you could take that back, I would appreciate it.
Good.
Anything else from the council on this issue? Okay. Brian, fiscal year 2021 TIP performance obligation report.
Yep, we have received our annual list of obligations. It's essentially a report that is provided to us from New York State DOT. Staff will be utilizing that information to develop our annual list of obligations. This is a federal requirement of all MPOs. So you can expect to receive that in January from MPO staff.
Any questions from the council members?
I do have one additional item. We should probably mention the Unified Planning Work Program.
That's what I was gonna bring it up. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. We did have the Unified Planning Work Program annual call for projects. We received one project proposal from the town of Woodstock. I don't want to get into any great detail, but it is regarding feasibility of bike and pedestrian infrastructure on a state route. So we'll be taking a look at that project proposal and seeing if it fits within the UPWP. But otherwise, right now, staff is very focused on year-end reporting, which is significant. There's a variety of different reports that we're all compiling right now to get done by the end of the year. And then we'll be moving into the update of the UPWP. So our next meeting is scheduled for January 25th. The New York State DOT strongly encourages MPOs to have the UPWPs approved by February so that they have time to review and then submit it to the FHWA by the end of March, by the end of the state fiscal year. So we'll be moving very quickly in the new year to get that document developed and the budget figured out. And I hope to have that ready for everyone by, I guess it would be January 15th.
So thank you, Brian. Any questions with respect to that? Okay, it's not too late, folks. If anybody has a particular study that they want done, or a particular thought that they think that the county, that the council should focus on, not necessarily related to their community, but perhaps countywide, now's the time to ask. As we staff are discussing internally what we're going to be focusing on. Now, we have a number of studies that we're going to start, including a rail study and a rail safety study in the city of Kingston. And we're also looking at following up on some of the safety work that David Stoss has been heading up to us, and that report's been completed. And there are a few other items, including the 4455 work that had been recommended last year for effort. But if anyone has anything that they would like us to look at, or even just as an informal consideration, shoot us an email, give Brian a call, or shoot us an email to discuss that. The other thing, I just want to circle back with respect to the TIP update. For those folks that have projects on the TIP that may be short money, I couldn't find another a better time to ask for additional funds to fill out your project than where we are right now as part of a TIP update. So Tilson Avenue comes to mind. There are projects, probably bridge projects, I think, in Ellenville and Warsing that come to mind. The county has a project on Route 299 that comes to mind. Now is the time to essentially come back and amend those projects as part of the TIP update process. Anything else? Any other new business or comments from the council members?
Dennis, it's Mike Baden. Has there been any more indication of what the infrastructure bill is going to mean in terms of projects or dollars or types of projects, or is that all still sort of in limbo until more answers come?
Well, clearly there's money's been allocated. We just haven't seen what that means for us in the region. And this is only on the transit side. There's also money down here with respect to broadband and others that's in here as well. So we haven't seen any responses to that. But we eagerly await NISDOT's decisions relative to allocations.
Do you anticipate that any of that might be allocated through CHIPS money, or because,
No.
municipality is always running
Rich?
into, we have to do our budget, and then the governor's budget doesn't come out till April 1st, so it's always a guess.
I don't think so. I think CHIPS money is entirely state. I know
Okay.
it's entirely state.
Yeah, I
but
didn't know
you
if
may
the
see it
state
in
would
bridge.
fund any of, use any of the infrastructure money to increase CHIPS funding or anything like that.
You may see changes with respect to Bridge New York programs,
Okay,
which is federal dollars.
got it.
But we just don't know at this
Okay.
point in time. The other thing is just don't forget, a lot of this Infrastructure and Jobs Act was directed towards transformative projects. So even though that there's been a general, Brian, did we ever send that presentation around that we had that shows the additional funds, and we had received that from the highway superintendents, as I recall.
Right, it was developed by Ron Epstein, CFO for New York State DOT, that was delivered to the Association of County Highway Officials. We have a copy of it, and we can certainly.
So why don't we send
try
that
to make it
around to
available.
council members if we can, and that may answer some of your questions in terms of what NISDOT's thinking is right now as it relates to the Infrastructure and Jobs Act from a transportation perspective. Is that okay, Brian, if we do that?
Well, and it's okay with me if it's okay with Ron.
Well, it's been shared out to the highway superintendent, so one would presume that it's a public document at this particular point in time.
Right, and I have several other PowerPoints. We'll certainly provide an overview of the
Thank you.
IIJ. Yes.
All right. So we'll get those out. All right. Anything else? Any other business before the council? Well, thank you, everyone. Have a safe, healthy, and happy holiday season. And we'll see you in January.
Yep. See you
Happy
next year.
I have a
holidays,
motion to
be
adjourn.
safe, stay healthy. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.